So this is about embodied cognition. And here's a quotation. I might butcher it. Ago ergo cogito. I act, therefore I think. And it's a play on Descartes' I think, therefore I am. And speaks to I act, therefore I think, speaks to a foundational commitment of embodied cognition. The idea is that we in this world, we act in this world, we are a being in this world, we're inseparable from this world. And our movement, our bodies, our movement in space and time is inseparable from what we think. Even abstract thought, right? Even yeah. So even higher order thinking, complex thinking, abstract thought, all those things are connected to our bodies, how they move in space and time. And that's a foundational commitment of body cognition. And you'll see that's going to be a different paradigm from understanding memory from the information processing theory. And to situate this discussion, well, let's go back to the importance. Let's go back to the topic of knowing students, right? Teachers have to know their students, and one of the ways in which teachers have to know their students is how they process information, how they come to remember, how they come to learn, how do they come to know anything. In the information processing theory, that that presents one model, one theory to explain this. Embodied cognition is another, and we're going to encounter a third concept, statistical learning, which isn't, I wouldn't call it a perspective, but it's a concept that gets us to think more complexly about this question of how people come to know, how they come to learn, how do they come to remember anything. And so the information processing theory, this is a very, very typical depiction of the information processing theory. It presents a linear model of information coming from an external source, going internally to be processed, to be processed by different mechanisms of the memory system. And as I said, this is based on a computer analogy for how memory works. And it can be a very useful model for thinking about teaching practices. However, I would argue that even though it can be a very useful model, it doesn't quite capture all the complexity in learning. So one of the things we see from the information processing theory is that they really overemphasize, or I would say overemphasize the role of active attention in learning and memory. And so a foundational commitment is that only that which you attend to for the information processing theory moves on to working memory to be processed and potentially stored into long-term memory. If one doesn't attend to it, it cannot move on. And for the information processing theory, attention is actively under one's control. Like one can choose what they pay attention to. And so the information processing theory to me reflects a strong commitment to a vision or a view of memory that puts a lot of control and intentionality in learning and memory. And we'll see from the concepts of embodied cognition, statistical learning, right? There's a little more complexity there to how it is that the mechanisms that are responsible for remembering. And so embodied cognition, it's a fairly recent, let's call it a fairly recent paradigm that emerged in response to information processing theory, which was dominant for several decades and actually arguably still pretty dominant today. One could see in certain there's a Deans for Impact Learning Sciences document, right? The idea of learning sciences, learning principles. If you look in that document, you can see the theory of memory is very much informed by information processing theory. And Deans for Impact is touted as the scientific list of science. it has these lists of scientific principles that teachers need to know, right? So in that document, you can see that information processing theory has a lot of influence in how scientific principles of learning are presented. So then we have embodied cognition. So embodied cognition, some folks see embodied cognition as an alternative paradigm to information processing theory, relying on different language, relying on a different metaphor, a different way of understanding how it is that we remember. And philosophically, I think they are incompatible in some ways. But thinking practically, I always say let's figure out how can we use these different theories to inform an understanding in ways to help the teaching and learning process. And so rather than seeing them as incompatible theories, I would always encourage folks to figure out, all right, what kinds of insights can one use from these different theories in order to form their teaching in ways to help students learn and help them teach and help students learn. So I always think rather than debating which one's right, which one's wrong, right? Let's debate like, okay, so what does if we see it this way, what does it afford us? How does it affect our understanding of students? How does it shape our teaching, right? And can we use these insights to shape classrooms in ways that's going to help students learn? And so I think thinking about it in that terms can be very helpful as educators. But to just talk a little bit about what embodied cognition is. And so there's different strands of embodied cognition. But I'd say overall, it's about bringing the body back into the understanding of thought. And the body not as a separate thing. Because you know I said a mind over matter, right? There's a lot of discourse about what the relationship is, the mind of the body, right? Which one of these things has control, and how do we exercise control over the other, right? And oftentimes we see as people, more ethical beings are people who sort of can control their bodily impulses, right, through masterful mindfulness, right? And so there's a lot of discourse about that relation between mind and body and what one does and how one should control the other. So embodied cognition tries to dissolve those kinds of boundaries and say, hey, we can't understand the mind without the body. We can't understand the body without the mind. These are inseparable entities. And so there's different, and so overall, I'd say they're trying to merge the mind, the body, and the world together as inseparable things, inseparable. So it's not as though we have an external world that enters into the mind and the body, right? But what's going on in the mind and the body are inseparable from the outside world. And there's lots of different strands that this can take. So one, in sort of rooted in more biology, is biological structures, right? Cells, organelles, the structure of our brain, like those things give shape what it's possible to think and do, right? So if you shape our bodies in different ways, if we had different structures, we would see things in very different ways. We'd move about the world in a very different way, right? But here the idea is biology determines what it is it's possible to think and do. That's not a strand that's really explored too much in educational psychology. Then we have another strand where mind, body, and world are inseparable and cannot be understood independently. Right. The idea here is that what people think it's not separated from the world. Right. What our consciousness is 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 part of the context, and the context, right? Uh, and so we don't have thoughts that are independent of that particular moment. Another strand is that movement shapes knowledge and ways of knowing. How we move, right, through the world, the space, the way space is structured, and how we can move through those structures shapes possibilities for what we can think. And the last one is biophysical states shape our thinking. Right, those biophysical states. When folks refer to biophysical states, they sometimes refer to these what may be called these biological agitations, where you experience some kind of change in your biological state. It can be fear, happiness, frustration. Those things are going to shape what you think, right? And so and there's research studies that show if people are feeling safe and secure, they tend to perceive things that aren't so threatening. But if they don't feel that safety and secure, that same thing they may experience as threatening, right? So what you feel at that moment is going to shape what you think. But all these things are, all these different strands are trying to bring the body back into the understanding of our thought as inseparable things, not something that influences it, right? But inseparable things. And so there's not this unidirectional or linear effect on these different processes. And so embodied cognition theorists might use different terms to try to explain memory. And so one of them is reperception. When we think about a memory, embodied theorists might say we don't use a working memory processing center to try to pull out a memory from this long-term memory storage. Rather, when we remember something, we're re-experiencing it. It's a reperception. And so, like an example might be when you're remembering something. Say you're remembering a Thanksgiving dinner, right? You might in remembering it, you might re-experience or re-perceive the sounds, the taste, the feelings of being there. And so you're not storing these, you're not retrieving these sort of abstract codes from this long-term memory to be recoded, right, to sort of form some memory, but you're re-experiencing something. And so that's a very different way of thinking about memory. And then another term they might use is meshing, right? And so when we think about, well, we have to build on memories, right? And we connect some experiences with old experiences, and we continue to evolve. Our memories evolve, our memories develop, right? We continue to add new memories, right? And so, but rather than rather than retrieving something, then taking new information and connecting it, right? What happens is our current experience, right, becomes meshed with a previous experience. And so as we're reperceiving something in a particular moment, we start to change that reperception, right, in some way by adding, right, by having a current experience that's shaping and changing that reperception. And so one's perceptions and reperceptions can be evolving and changing over time based on that current moment. Now, and so in order to reperceive something, all right, so because context is inseparable from what we think, right? So if what I'm thinking at this moment is inseparable from everything that's around me, how could I reperceive something? And so embodied theorists might say, well, that's where suppression comes in, where we have to block out something from the current context in order to reperceive something. So if you ever think of an example of when maybe someone asked you for directions and you had to try to reperceive directions, right? Maybe you had to try to envision that route, right? Sometimes one might close their eyes, they might look down, they might look up. The idea is they're suppressing something from that environment so they can reperceive that route. And this is what, and so if you think about embodied cognition, so if you, some folks say, if you study, if say you chew gum while you're studying, chewing a minty gum, they'd say, well, you should chew that minty gum during an exam because it helps to reperceive, right, that sensation, that minty gum. It helps to reperceive that moment of studying. Some folks would argue that it's really good to write things down, right? Writing things down can help one to be able to remember things better because the act of moving, the movement of that hand can help that reperception of that memory. Right? So there's lots of different examples to help illustrate the ways in which the body, the movement, right, can help facilitate or are responsible for memory. And you can see this does potentially offer a very different paradigm for information processing theory. But I think we can use insights from embodied theory, embodied cognition. So first of all, both of these are theories. They're both theories to try to make sense of how it is that we remember. Information processing theory. The thing that irritates me about the information processing theory is that it is a metaphor that's seen as a scientific principle of learning. Um, and I think if we call that scientific, we might ignore insights from other theories that might push us to think a little more complexly about how it is that we remember. And so if we don't take into account ideas of embodied cognition, maybe maybe we can't utilize context, structures of context, the body, as well as we could in trying to facilitate a classroom, to try to facilitate students learning and achieving teaching goals.